We started in Flinders Lane, which was a ghost town. There wasn't a lot going on. There was probably about 2 cafes, and that's probably how we started as this collective. Rents were very cheap, buildings were unoccupied, and that goes for parts of Swanston Street too. You know, Curtin House that we know now as Cookie, the Toffin rooftop, that wasn't there.
And at that time, Crossley Street was much less kind of funky than it is now. It was quite a quiet space and the rent was very cheap, so it was a really good area to begin a business in, particularly a business that really focuses on the cultural aspects of Melbourne.
Melbourne's inner city. There was a time about 20 odd years ago when the central business district was just that, open for business only. After the workers had gone home, the inner city was deserted. But it was at that time that the seeds were sown for the bustling town full of creative activity, of design businesses and mind-boggling architecture that you see today. Why? Because the rents were cheap and there were lots of empty buildings because of the economic recession of the 1980s, which meant that many businesses closed and moved out. This kind of phenomenon seems terrible at the time, but it's the most fertile breeding ground for creative growth. It means artists and designers have space available to realise their ideas. They can network with their peers and don't need to work every waking minute for money. They can experiment. This tour is as much about individual design and architecture destinations as it is about telling the story of Melbourne as a creative city. Listen to the designers on this tour and you'll find out that many were able to start because they were given the opportunity to take over old, empty, decrepit buildings.
This has been closed and unoccupied for a very, very long time, this building.
Since the 1950s, actually, this particular level.
It was virtually a sort of semi-derelict residential building that was in jeopardy of being in trouble with council, basically.
He offered us the laundry, which is what this used to be. So we put a front window in it and here we are.
And here you are, walking the streets, reaping the fruits of this development. This tour introduces you to many key players who are involved in bringing creativity into the inner city. Places you will visit include some creative nodes where a cluster of designers and design businesses operate, and also includes half a dozen architecture projects. So scale on this tour will constantly shift. 1 minute you might be learning about an architect. Next minute you'll hear about the development of the fashion community. And as architects and critics introduce you to individual places and projects, you'll hear a lot about the local design and architectural community and its history.
As is often the case with the post-war emigres in architecture and photography and so forth, their input was extraordinarily significant because with them came this sort of European sense of modernism.
To understand the architectural culture of Melbourne, you have to understand that over the years it's always operated on 3 poles of endeavour.
The city realised, having worked on making the city livable for 25 years, the next big agenda was sustainability.
And of course you'll realise that each of the buildings you will visit are not just the product of creative thinking, but in turn they make a huge contribution back to the architecture and design community.
This is the first building in the world which uses the new mathematics.
It's showcasing a kind of more sophisticated idea about Australian urbanism.
This building pretty much looks like what it is and how it works. So form follows function in the truest sense.
Then there are the anecdotes that come with each project. Many of them are already part of the design folklore of this town.
I don't think we've ever provided a client with over 50 facade designs, which we did on this one, before we arrived at our final design.
He eventually said, well, I have a sense of humour and I'm going to give you a permit, but on condition that you build it behind a screen, because if any of my colleagues see it, they'll force me to stop it.
Because there are so many different kinds of design on this tour, so many different players and backgrounds, this is an excellent way to realise the connections between design disciplines and see how each influences the other.
When we were around in the early 90s, really, you could probably count on two hands the amount of emerging designers now, designers in Melbourne that are coming out of RMIT and also the other design schools, or have many more opportunities.
The designers, gallerists and store owners on this tour all share their personal visions and ideas. And as you visit these places, you'll be able to recognise how these visions are reflected in the work they show or sell.
We still fight quite hard to remain called a gallery rather than a shop.
There's not a lot of advertising, there's not a lot of signage, so we want people to sort of find this sort of like little rabbit hole and then fall into it, and then they can get lost in the space.
I've come to recognise when someone has more than one idea.
All of these personal stories provide an insight into the life of designers, an open and sometimes unglamorous account of the false starts and new beginnings, and the hardship many designers have overcome.
And it's been a really long road. We moved back to Bridget's parents' house nearly 9 years ago, and we're working out of a spare bedroom for 2 years, and we've come a long way since then.
I guess my family is rather conservative, religious, and traditional. It's kind of becoming relevant because what I want to do was so different from that. I want to do something creative.
The Audio Design Museum is a living museum where the city becomes the exhibition space. You could look at it like an urban safari about creativity. If you want to do the entire tour, you can download it to your device and print out the maps, which will guide you to the individual locations and give you some backgrounds on the designers. There you can listen to designers in their studios, their galleries and businesses. So it's a show and tell about their ideas, their creativity, and about the work they've made.